Good afternoon, I would say, for all the participants in Italy and in Europe. Good morning to our guests from US, from East Carolina. And thank you for joining at early morning for you. And these are the MINDtheGEPs Open Forums. These are basically open meeting where we discuss of gender equality in research and innovation. We invite speakers from different EU countries and now also from other research systems as the US. And MINDtheGEPs is a EU-funded project supporting gender equality in research and innovation, and in particular supporting the gender equality plans as tools for improving gender equality in research and innovation. And we have a number of implementing partners who are contributing to the project, and many of us are learning a lot from the open forums as a way of discussing and also learning from other experience. So today, I think we have a really great occasion of learning because we will speak with our 4 guests. This is also the first time we have 4 presenters, and thank you to you for guests. And I'll just give you the floor in a minute. So we have today Allison Danell and Stephanie George, Andrew Morehead, I hope the pronunciation is right, and Kristen Myers. And they are all from East Carolina University, and specifically they are working on the Thrive project. We will learn about the Thrive project in a moment from their voice directly. But what is important to us as MINDtheGEPs consortium and partners is that the Thrive project is supported by the National Science Foundation in the US, I would say, with a similar logic, with a similar, let's say, approach that the European Commission is doing with the MINDtheGEPs project. So the idea is that the university, academia, and research organization have a structural problem of inequality, both in the access, in the participation, and then in the career advancement. And this problem needs to be addressed at structural level and at cultural level. So as we say, gender equality is not about, it's not a women problem. It is a problem of the university and research centers. It's the problem of how these are organized. Is a problem about how the scientific work and organization of the scientific work is done, and we need to work on these dynamics. So we need to change culturally and structurally our organization. So this is nice, and I think we can learn from a completely different research system as the US. And yeah, so I would say we can start, and we can start from a very important word, that is equity. In your presentation here, we have the word equity, and as we were saying before, we use in Europe the word equality. So the European Commission lexicon is gender equality, and so we can, I think, also start from this word, from this wording, and then you can go on presenting the Thrive project. And I'm giving the floor to you. I think the first is Allison, if I have right the list of the speaker, but then
that's exactly right.
Yeah, thank you, Allison.
So much. Thank you for the invitation and for the lovely introduction. And we really appreciate continuing these conversations that we were able to start when Kristen and I visited our colleagues in Italy last summer. What we'd like to tell you about, as Lucio said, was leveraging privilege, advocates, allies, and gender equity in universities. And when we talk about the word equity, what we're thinking about in our lexicon is the idea that we've perhaps expanded or refocused from equality to equity. So in my mind, the goals are similar. We're trying to get to a status where people have equal opportunities or equal privilege in their workplace or any other arena where we're talking about that kind of end goal of equality. What I think the word equity incorporates is the idea that we may need to create or curate different opportunities for people to get to that status. And so the word equity to me takes into account any different opportunities or programs that people may need because they may be coming from different circumstances. And so it takes that into account that there may be a different road for them. And so the programming or opportunities that we give people takes that into account. We can think of those sometimes as boosts, as help that we offer people, maybe strengthening their voice, special opportunities in terms of professional development or access to other types of support programs. But I think our goals are very similar. I think the word equity just takes into account the journey. So next slide, please. We do have a multidisciplinary team. So we have our presenters shown here again. I am the principal investigator for this particular grant from the National Science Foundation. So I'm proud to offer leadership and support to this team that includes the folks on this slide, as well as a number of other people from across East Carolina University. When we think about the team, it has both scientists in the natural or life sciences fields. It has scientists in the social sciences fields. We also have folks from engineering, mathematics, et cetera. So it's at the university. So it's a broad team and it's a broad group at the university that we represent. So it's a talented team. I'm happy to kick us off today. The next slide gives us an overview of today's talk. So we did want to orient our colleagues to the National Science Foundation's program, and maybe our conversation after this presentation will help us compare and contrast more about the European Union's approach and the United States' approach. So the National Science Foundation grants enable gender transformation of universities. We'd like to talk about a particular program that was developed at another university in the United States that has been made available to us to adapt. And that word will come up again when we talk about the types of grants that the National Science Foundation makes available, which include the adaptation of successful programs from other universities. So we'll be in a position to give you a brief history and how it has been implemented here at East Carolina University. We'll also spend some time telling you about some of the obstacles that we've faced, and I think we have some really interesting accounts and perspectives from our colleagues here at ECU. And that will all link back to how allies, advocates and allies has helped us kind of frame those conversations and learn more about what our colleagues are facing. Next slide, please. So to orient us all, I want to point out that maybe I didn't mention in my opening statement of the slide, I'm a chemistry professor. So while I'm an administrator now, this is a lived experience for me. And so many of these barriers for women in STEM, so science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, are quite familiar. There are barriers such as gender bias in hiring and evaluation. There can be a lack of support for families and caregivers. We recognize that there are inadequate and sometimes unequal workplace resources, which may kind of illustrate the importance of the vocabulary we were talking about before in terms of the word equity. There are gender pay gaps that are demonstrable across lots of different areas in STEM. The workplaces are often masculinized, And then we can also add in these other intersectional inequalities that go along with other identified groups like race, ethnicity, sexuality, etc. Next slide, please. The National Science Foundation, which is one of our major federal funding agencies here in the United States that supports a variety of areas, including very classic STEM areas, and it often goes out into more applied fields, generated and implemented a program called the Grant Program. It has supported hundreds of different institutions across the United States. And it is a program that is designed to truly dig into systemic factors that support equity, as we've talked about, and inclusion, and also to try to break down some of the issues that tend to persist in these organizations. And so it is specifically focused on academic institutions and those workplaces where we see these systemic problems. So we have a map of the United States showing all the different areas that have been supported. The depth of color tells you whether or not they've received more or fewer grants from the National Science Foundation. Regardless, the representation is almost 100% across the United States. Next slide, please. So I mentioned that there are several types of grants awarded, and this shows a timeline for how those different areas of focus have developed over the last 20 years. So the National Science Foundation very recently celebrated their 20th anniversary of awarding grants in this advanced program. It really began with trying to identify people or individuals that could be supported with leadership and other professional development support. But I think it also, when we think about the systemic issues that we've described, one of the most important categories at the onset of the program was the idea of trying to transform an entire institution. And so the focus on individuals fairly quickly faded, and the focus on systemic transformation of institutions really grew by recognizing that not only can proposals that are very worthy be funded for transformations of individual institutions based on their specific situation, there are other ways to take advantage of successes or the literature that can tell us how to adapt, how to work in teams, how to generate ideas that really are cross-cutting. So the type of grant that I want to highlight, and I believe it's on the next slide, no, in a couple of slides, I'll tell you about the adaptation, but I'll highlight the vocabulary word here, the adaptation. So we're talking in this presentation today about adapting a particular program that has been successful. And the reason for that focus is because of the type of grant that we were awarded here at ECU. So next slide, please. So again, I emphasized on the timeline from the previous slide that there were initial focus points on individuals, but I think the literature and the experiences of those early awards tells us that we should be thinking about how to advance or transform an entire institution, and that many of the barriers that result in gender inequity or inequality are systemic in nature. So there are multiple strategies for this kind of change. We can look at processes and whether or not they are biased in nature. And I think most universities, regardless of their location, have no shortage of processes that might introduce some inequity. There are cultural factors that we think, and there's a lot of literature that show that can really impact these kind of inequalities. We talked about one major barrier for women advancement in STEM being related to family and caregiving roles. And so when we think about transforming institutions, trying to allow people to talk about and perhaps even address issues that they have with balancing work and life can be very important. And then lastly, we can still be thinking about supporting individual success, but that is much more obviously individualized than thinking about the entire systems. Next slide, please. So we here at ECU have an NSF Advance Award. As I mentioned, that is an adaptation grant. There is an acronym that we use that spells out the word thrive, which really captures what we're hoping to do for our institution and the individuals that make up our community here at the institution, is that we hope they will thrive. And what it stands for is towards hiring, resources, inclusion, value, and excellence. And as I mentioned, these types of awards from the National Science Foundation are relatively recent compared to the full history of advanced grant awardings. And it is because they've recognized at the agency that informing the projects with the literature, both successes and failures can be exceptionally useful when we think about transforming universities. Next slide, please. I do want to tell you a little bit about our institution, because I do think that different elements of what the institution has areas of excellence in, who they serve, where it's even located can sometimes influence that. So East Carolina University is a public doctoral university. We do have a large research segment of our responsibilities and our achievements. We're located in the southeastern United States. We are the 4th largest university in the state of North Carolina. So the state of North Carolina has a 17 campus system. And so we are governed by not only our own campus, but that 17 campus system. There is a lot of organizational, not limitations necessarily, but certainly oversight on what we do and how we do it. ECU is a large comprehensive university with about 30,000 people enrolled, most of whom live here in this city of Greenville, North Carolina, although we do serve some students through distance education. We have a medical school, a dental school, other healthcare related foci, as well as very typical arts and sciences colleges like the one I lead, engineering and technology, education, business, areas like that. We have assessed our university's organizational structure and determined that it has what we would categorize as 23 different departments, which contain faculty, programs, and students pursuing programs in that department. 23 STEM departments here at East Carolina University, although based on the way our National Science Foundation defines and supports those types of fields, we do not include our clinical departments. So we wouldn't include a department of surgery or a college of nursing. Women faculty are underrepresented in STEM. And so we have a chart here that shows our total % women in STEM fields in ECU using those definitions of our 23 STEM departments. It's just at 30%. And we can see that in our engineering and technology related fields, that is got the lowest representation at 17.6%. Our natural sciences, which would include fields like my own, like chemistry, but also physics and biology, has about 32% of representation of women. On the next slide, we'll show how underrepresentation is exacerbated by rank. And so what we have plotted here is data from East Carolina University. So this is specific to our institution. And it shows the typical life cycle of a faculty member, where they may be in an instructor position that is very focused on teaching, but if they started an assistant professor rank, then they would have available to them on the tenure track the ability to reach ranks of associate and full professor, which is the top rank in our system, over a period of anywhere from 12 to about 12 years is the minimum. Any other time past that, you might choose to apply for a full professor rank. And so in purple are our male colleagues, and in yellow or gold are our female colleagues. And we can see that the gold representation shrinks as we move across this, this chart towards the final rank of professor. If we look on the other side of the slide, we can see that there's a breakdown in assistant, associate, and full professor. And here again, we're focused on the gold being women and the purple being men. And we can see that there are elements of underrepresented minority women also being making up a true minority statistically of the population here at ECU. So this really persists, this pattern really persists across that life cycle of the faculty member. So we're proud of being able to perhaps increase the number of women or underrepresented minority women at the outset of their career when they're hiring. But even as we focus on hiring and including increasing our diversity in hiring, I would call this a leaky pipeline, meaning we are losing people either along the way to other fields or other discipline, other employment opportunities, or they're simply not being supported or not having the opportunities necessarily to be promoted. I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Stephanie George now, who both is an engineering professor here at ECU and also has a position at the National Science Foundation. And she'll tell us a little bit more about the further goals of our Thrive grant.
Thank you, Allison. So the data that you just heard from Allison was utilized along with additional institution-specific findings that will be discussed later, really as a jumping off point for us as a team to study and transform ECU. And so I'll talk a little bit about our 3 goals for this project. The first goal of Thrive is to change the culture. We want to build a culture of inclusion by increasing the multicultural competencies of faculty and leaders to engage and advance faculty development across identities, as well as intersections thereof. We have 2 strategies that we have employed to achieve this goal. The first strategy was to adapt the program Advocates and Allies, which leverages privileged groups to interrupt bias in the moment. And we'll take a closer look at the Advocates and Allies program later in the presentation. The second strategy is to achieve goal 1 is to increase multicultural competence among faculty and leaders. And here we provided innovative learning opportunities where the leaders become aware of their own biases and are equipped with ways to address the now visible bias practices around them. So the allies and the advocates and all of the bias conscious leaders, gatekeepers, and faculty represent a critical mass that's committed to interrupting bias, resulting hopefully in a transformed culture at ECU. The second goal is to provide resources and cultivate support networks within and among STEM units. The strategy used was to establish material resources and a network of support for community among STEM women to ensure inclusion, particularly among faculty that are further marginalized by race, LGBTQ plus or other minoritized statuses. Specifically, we have hosted community learning exchanges and networking events. We have launched professional development series, such as Stepping Up in STEM and Arrive and Thrive in Leadership. We have supported women faculty to participate in leadership training at the state level and the national level. The third goal is to implement structural and change and remove barriers. Thrive works to interrupt bias policies, to embed equity and diversity into faculty governance, and create incentives to remove barriers, hopefully enabling lasting change. We've worked closely with our faculty governance to adopt policies that infuse diversity, equity, and inclusion in the faculty manual, which is our governance document. We have examined faculty search policies and hosted a leadership retreat on search equity. We will continue to examine policies, procedures, and practices and work with our leaders to identify accountability measures, including both rewards and perhaps penalties. To accomplish these three goals, we utilize a holistic approach to transform ECU. So we will address inequities at the interactional, the structural, and cultural level, such that changes at one level support and reinforce changes at other levels. We use the metaphor of a tree, which you can see here, and you may have noticed earlier in the presentation. So the cultural changes will nourish a positive environment and enable women to flourish. The support systems will anchor women and allow women to draw on and leverage institutional networks. The structural changes will provide a sturdy foundation and enable sustainability in changing environments. So like a tree with green leaves, deep roots, and a strong trunk, this NSF Advanced project empowers all women, including those who identify as women, to reach their highest potential and thrive. So now I will pass it over to Kristen to talk more about our institutional data.
Thank you, Stephanie. So midway through, I mean, like a lot of you, we started this project during the pandemic, which did affect our trajectory and our goals. And so we were a little behind on doing this data gathering step, but we were able to get to it in the spring of this year. So in April, we conducted focus group interviews with faculty of different ranks to find out what they need and what they are expecting from Thrive. So by that time, they had learned what Thrive is, and we'd sensitized them to the vocabulary that we use and our goals. And so then it was in time to talk to them directly and find out what they were expecting from our research team. Stephanie, we go to the next slide. So the focus group interviews are different than face-to-face interviews. You meet with a group of people and ask them probing questions, and each interview is quite different depending on the things that that group wants to talk about. They're all asked the same questions, but they may go in a very different direction. And so in order to facilitate kind of safe spaces for conversation, we organize the focus groups by kind of common rank or common interest. And so I conducted 13 focus groups with faculty of all ranks in 2022. The total number of people who participated was 50. And we organized them by assistant professor. We have instructors, so we call this fixed term because they don't have a tenure track contract. We did focus groups with them, focus groups with full professors, associate professors who had been at rank for under 6 years, and focus groups with those who have been at rank over 6 years. And here in the US, in our system, which I understand after meeting with you all this summer is different from some of your universities, faculty can go up for full professor if they feel like their record is sufficiently advanced and developed after usually about 6 years. And they can just do that regardless of whether their chair has invited them to do so. There's no position that they have to apply for. They can just choose to go up. And so after about 6 years, if faculty are still at the associate level, it's interesting to hear from them what challenges and experiences they've faced that have not pushed them forward into that next level of the highest rank of full. Also did focus groups with department chairs and personnel committee chairs. And there were several people who could not attend the focus groups, and so they asked for a survey option, and 13 people took that. We did open the focus groups to, there was also a focus group on women in STEM in particular. This, however, was open to people of all genders and races. As you can see, most of the people who participated were white women, but there was a broad spectrum of people who participated. Stephanie, next slide, please. and we'll just skip right. This is just a placeholder. Okay, so I coded the data using in vivo software and noted that of course, because of the questions that I asked, but also the interest of the people interviewed coalesced around our 3 goals in several ways. And so today I'm going to talk to you about data from 2 of the goals that are most related to the Advocates and Allies project, and that is changing culture and creating support systems. And that really is where we had plugged in our tree metaphor, advocates and allies to try to support these transformational elements. Every data point that we focused on had at least 12 pieces of data that came out of different focus groups, and some had up to 62 data points with an average of 29 data points. So these are patterned responses that where the faculty, the subjects, and the focus groups talked about issues that aligned with Thrive's goals, and we're asking Thrive to help mediate some of the things that they're dealing with. So this first piece of data comes from the pattern related to changing culture, and it was about feeling disrespected. And so this white woman assistant professor says, there's been more than one comment made by more than one faculty member about how young I am. They're like, oh, if you don't dress a certain way, you're going to be misconstrued for a student. Or, oh, I thought you were a student, not a faculty member. And it's been said by male and female senior faculty to me in front of other faculty. I think it's a total lack of respect, and it made me feel like, wow, okay, I guess I'm not supposed to be here, you know, or I don't count as much. And it's happened a lot. I mean, it's happened several times since I started at ECU, you know, mostly comments on my age and, you know, you look really young. And I don't think that's ever said to men. It's only said to women. And so the people who talked about this felt that they had been infantilized, that their work was also being dismissed, their contributions to the discipline in the field. And they also went on to say, you know, sometimes I do more work than some of these senior people, and that adds an extra layer of insult to this, you know, noting what my body looks like in this space and telling me that I don't belong. The next slide, Stephanie. Another response or pattern that was related to changing culture was about feeling invisible. Their work was either neglected entirely or rendered invisible by the people who evaluate them, who are important to them as leaders and departmental agents. So this white woman assistant professor, so she's not tenured yet, says, I won an R01 grant, which is like a really top grant, by the way. I mean, I don't know if you all have the same kind of categorization, but these are highly competitive and very lots of money associated with them. So she says, I won an R01 grant. My chair didn't acknowledge it. Then the following faculty meeting, my chair highlighted a publication that a senior faculty member got and mentioned nothing about my R01. 3 meetings later, I had to announce it myself. I gave him that opportunity and I was like, well, I'm not going to sit here and have no one know that I've achieved the success that I sought to achieve, right? And then my associate dean for research announced my grant during a faculty meeting, but he said this other woman won it. No, I thought you tried to acknowledge me, but you don't even have the decency to know my name. So this happened a lot, that women, and this is a woman in STEM, felt like she'd done these goals that were her own personal goals, but they also really helped the department and the university, and her work was completely neglected and made her feel like she didn't belong. Next slide, Stephanie. So another change culture goal was about inequity, and going back to what Allison was saying. So, you know, and I think it's really interesting that you pointed out this use of this term. So inequity here just means like, given the same opportunities, folks are not seen as meeting the same level. They're not valued at the same level in this quote here. So this is, she's pointing out it's also inequality here. She thinks it's unfair that the women in her unit are doing more of the service work than men. And so I would say that is a power dynamic that we would relate to inequality as well. So possibly I should call this inequality. So this is a white woman associate professor who also is the director of the undergraduate studies program in her department. She said, I don't think that kind of work, which is advising and changing curriculum, gets spread around enough. I had somebody at my undergraduate committee the other day, a full professor, say, oh, I'm sorry, I'm too busy to do that assessment work this semester. And I said, but that's what this committee does. And he basically said, no, I'm sorry, I'm not. I just don't, I can't. I don't have any mechanism to make a person do anything. And I'll lay this out here, and maybe it's controversial to some of you, she's saying to the people in the focus group. I'll leave it at this. There's an expectation that women are going to do service. And if you don't, people really look at you like, oh, look at her. She's not doing that. The men in my department who don't do as much service, it's like, oh, well, you can't count on him to do anything. And that came up again and again, that the full professor men can just choose to not do the labor that has to be done by the unit, and that there is no reinforcement, there's no expectation, and they really, that's their privilege. They can definitely do that. And it just creates more work for the women who don't opt out. And they could also, but they don't, because they'll be punished for it disproportionately, they perceive, and also the work has to get done. Okay, next slide, Stephanie. Another theme related to increasing support, goal number 2, was just harassment. So being mistreated, noticing mistreatment by mostly male professors against all kinds of people at the university. So women professors, also graduate students and staff. And so this white woman full professor said, I've always been a faculty member whom many students come to. I have tissues in my office next to my office chair because students will come to me because they perceive me as being an advocate for students, and I guess empathetic and compassionate. Recently, more students have been coming to me about concerns of collegiality and lack of equitable treatment in the lab. So this is a STEM department as well. These occasionally are males, the students, but more often than not, they're female students. More often than not with a male advisor, and usually an older male full professor. And the issue of toxicity in the laboratory that the professor isn't addressing because they still have this in mind, very old idea of what it means to be a doctoral or master's student, that is sink or swim. If you can't handle it, then you're not good enough. It's a huge problem. And so I have students coming to me, and when I tried to bring it up to the next level to address, with the department chair, the chair said, oh, this is the student's problem. And when I talk to the deans, they say, well, have you talked to the chair? Yes, they've done nothing. Well, the chair needs to talk to the faculty member. So there's some missteps in leadership in terms of ensuring that our faculty are good mentors to their students. And so, what happens is kind of this chain of command, like, well, you have to follow these steps if you want us to do anything about the mistreatment of students, and running them off and, creating that leaky pipeline that Allison talked about earlier, is individualized. It's just, oh, that's his personality, or, oh, you didn't follow protocol, instead of having a system of support for these students and also for the faculty who are trying to make change. Okay, next. And the last one that I'll talk about from the data that's also related to increasing support is this work-life imbalance. And it was really interesting in the focus groups that when asked, and they were all asked this, one woman said, people only ask that about 2 women. Men don't get asked about how they're balancing their work and their life because it's assumed they don't have a problem with that. And I thought that was interesting, but it definitely is a problem that women articulate very clearly. And so this is a white woman associate professor, and, reflecting on what all of us have experienced as part of the pandemic, just making all of this so much worse. So sorry, I left that first few lines in there. I apologize. I don't get a lot of downtime per se, but that's been more of the last 2 years COVID problem than pre-COVID. But unfortunately, I don't think that COVID getting better means that the situation is necessarily going to change. So it might be a little bit of the new normal. I've always taught face-to-face. Again, pre-COVID, I taught all face-to-face. I preferred that immensely, but I picked up an online course now. In post-COVID world, I have 2 face-to-face and 1 online sections. The expectation in my department, that the stated expectation in my department, is that you respond to all student emails within 24 hours, weekends, holidays, whatever. You have a 24-hour clock to respond to the student. And that's probably been the hardest thing from a balance / mental health perspective. I go down a rabbit hole. I'm sure I'm not alone in this, but I just can't turn my email on and scan it to see if there's anything that needs a reply. If I pull it up, I get sucked in a rabbit hole of dealing with all of it, and it takes a chunk of time. It's hard to turn off. So it gets, our computer system gives us these reports that say how many minutes you had of quiet time and like how many days you had of quiet time. And those reports actually can make you feel really bad. And so that's what she pointed out. And so the imbalance is just really pointed, particularly for women faculty, particularly women faculty with family responsibilities outside of work. Okay, Stephanie, next. So these are all related to advocates and allies. And so now I will turn it over to our lead advocate, Andrew Morehead, to talk about how the advocates and allies are dealing with this.
So I think I'm next, Kristen.
Oh,
so,
are you?
Yep.
Oh, I apologize, Stephanie.
No
Go ahead,
problem.
Stephanie.
So now that you've heard about these issues that we've uncovered at ECU, how can Thrive address them and other issues reported by faculty? So as mentioned before, our first strategy was to adapt advocates and allies. And this program, Advocates and Allies, was first developed at North Dakota State University as part of an NSF Advance grant. Advocates and Allies offers an intersectional approach to disrupting entrenched hierarchies, and the program has been successfully implemented at over 20 institutions in the United States, including institutions that are similar to ECU. The goal of Advocates and Allies is to recruit, train, and deploy members of historically privileged groups on campus to interrupt and correct interpersonal and procedural biases in the moment, and to proactively work to change culture, practices, and policies. So we want to leverage power and privilege and create a we rather than an us them. And ultimately, the advocates and allies will act as everyday agents of change, helping to shift the culture, to create accountability, and to enforce university level policies that formally prohibit biases. So one question you may have is, what is male privilege? So it is the undue or unearned advantage that benefits men in male dominant organizations and society. So some examples from academia include never having to be the first. This could be the first male faculty member or full professor, chair, etc. It means never wondering if his gender gave him an advantage in the hiring or funding process. It means always having role models and mentors and seldom feeling out of place. And there are numerous others, as you can see on this slide. However, the greatest privilege is not having to think about aspects of your identity. So how does Advocates and Allies work? So it helps to correct, as I mentioned, the entrenched power imbalances that reproduce white men's privilege in the academy. It takes the onus from off of marginalized faculty who report feeling socially isolated and exhausted from fighting bias fatigue at work and in their communities. And it recognizes that lasting change requires ongoing interventions for including diversity. So I just wanted to point out, because this is a question we often get, what's the difference between advocates and allies? So advocates are a smaller group of men that have a greater responsibility. So typically these are senior male faculty. They are unsatisfied with the current gender equity landscape. They are willing to educate themselves and other men about issues of gender equity or inequity, and they are accountable to a group primarily composed of women. The advocates also have the roles of the allies, but the allies, again, are male faculty. They are trained by the advocates on gender inequity and equity, and they are committed to being active and vocal proponents of gender diversity and equity. So how did we implement or establish, I'll say this at ECU? This was done through allied training, from which a team of advocates engaged in additional self-directed growth to ultimately deliver professional learning opportunities. So the launch of Advocates and Allies was a little bit delayed due to COVID. So we were working directly with some of the original developers of Advocates and Allies at North Dakota State University, and they were hesitant about offering these ally workshops virtually. But they did eventually agree to do this, and so we first held a virtual ally workshop, which is where men learn about gender bias, and the presentation is supported with data from literature as well as showing data from the institution. In order to recruit attendees, we sent out targeted invitations to attend the training. And again, this was delivered by Roger Green and colleagues who are experienced, seasoned advocates from outside ECU. So it was mentioned by the workshop presenters that we had one of the largest turnouts at the time for a virtual ally workshop. We currently have over 50 plus allies that have gone through this program. So after this, we sent out a call for advocates, and again, we tried targeted invitations, but it was also an open call. We did have an application and review process that we used to select the advocates. It was recommended to have a small group to start with, and so we selected 8. The advocates who were selected then participated in a 2-day facilitation, again, moderated by those same experienced advocates that came to do the ally workshops. The advocates crafted a mission statement, objectives, and action plans, and their facilitation ended with a presentation of their draft plan to Thrive, as well as our internal steering committee. And as I said, we have 8 advocates currently, and I will turn this over now to our lead advocate, Andrew Morehead.
Thank you, Stephanie. We're going to spend just a second on this slide, just simply because Stephanie already laid out the process by which this group of 8 advocates was selected. It was competitive. It was thoughtful in the sense that we tried to get representation across a lot of departments. So we have several from the STEM departments on the main campus, engineering, chemistry, biology, and so on, geology. We also have 2 from social sciences. That's really helpful in terms of implementation, because that gives you people who have the perspective to read the literature that may not be as familiar to those of us from, a chemistry department. And 2 folks from the basic sciences over on health sciences. So that's the picture of the current 8. We do have limits on our terms. Well, we've decided to have limits on our terms, so we will be kind of going through another set of process to add as some of these folks rotate off. So anyway, next slide. Thank you, Stephanie. So we've done 5 trainings now on campus. You heard from Stephanie that we've got over 50 folks that have been through that training. All of the allies, all the advocates have been through that ally training. I'm going to talk more about the content, but we certainly talk about data of a variety of kinds of things, on microaggressions, on interrupting biases, and other things like that. And we focus a lot on then practice recognizing when these kinds of things are occurring and what allies can do to intervene. On the right-hand side, you see some of the one of the handouts that's given out that we also use for recruiting. I wanted to say just a moment about that. We may want to come back. I know we're short on time when we get into the open discussion, but recruiting people who are not already deeply interested in this is often a challenge. So we don't want to preach just to the choir, which is maybe a term that is not as familiar, but it's easy to get people who are already invested to come to these trainings. The hard part is identifying and recruiting people who are not already interested in these subjects. And we've done a variety of things. We're working on bring a friend kind of event, so asking our current allies to go out and recruit. One of our folks on health sciences has been very good at meeting with upper administration and basically saying, we will do a cohort training, and we've got some of those already underway that we're planning for the spring semester. All right, so yep. So here are a couple of examples of the kinds of slides you see. On the left-hand side is one of the introductory slides, and on the right-hand side is one of the later sort of bridge examples where we talk about how those microaggressions occur, how one might recognize them, and then what message they send to female faculty. So one of the things that we've done, and we'll do a couple in the next few slides, but we started out talking a lot about data, both ECU specific data. You saw one of those slides earlier that Allison talked about with the inequities across ranks and promotions. We talked a lot about studies on implicit bias. We found that folks at some point were overwhelmed by the sheer amount of data we had, so we've cut back on data and spent more time talking about scenarios that are useful for having open conversation among the trainers and the trainees and those allies training. So if you could go on to the next slide. These are two mini scenarios that we use. These are designed to have the allies and the training think about the context of how power imbalances occur. And so you might just say, you have a person who makes a sexist comment. Okay, if you're a student, how does that make you feel, right? Are you empowered in any way to respond to that? What if that's in front of a parent? What if that person is one of your peers, in other words, another faculty member? What if that person is in a position of power above you, if they're an administrator or an alumni, wealthy alumni or donor? What happens when that person says they're just joking? How does one handle that? So those are the kinds of conversations that we want to have. And like I said, when we had the North Dakota State slides, I think we're about 80 slides long in an hour and a half training. And there was a lot of data. We very quickly started cutting those because the feedback that we got from folks who were in those trainings was that they preferred to have conversations among themselves and the facilitators about how to handle these situations. And then why don't we go on to the next slide, Stephanie. And so this, I think, was one of the two. We have one of these on what happens in a meeting. We have one of these that happens on a search committee conversation. So these I think have been the most popular choices of what we've had. I'm not going to go ahead and read through this one. I'll let you read through it for a second. So at this point, right, we've talked about some of the climate, some of the inequities, about what a microaggression might be, whether one interrupts, for example. And we had about a 10 to 15 minute discussion on each one of these two during our trainings. And one of the things that I was struck by during this, right, is that we've just been through all of these trainings on identifying, what's going on. And the conversation in those meetings really tended to be around a discussion of the data now about these kinds of things. And it was about halfway through when I had to ask the question, how about the female colleagues who stopped participating in the discussion, right? That I think that there was some issues there, again, around identifying and then what the strategies are. And so we talked then about, calling on her and saying, look, I would like to hear more about this from my colleague. But it also brings up how an ally outside of it has to make sure that the female colleague is invited to informal events, that they have a support network, that they have someone to talk with. And in particular, we want to avoid what colloquially we use white knight, or savior complex. The idea that allies are a support system who's working on improving a climate, and there are many ways we can do that, and that they don't just involve jumping in and ham-handedly, castigating your colleagues, but also trying to make substantive long-term change in the climate. So maybe the next slide, we'll just sort of summarize that briefly. So an advocate, as we've defined it, is a position. It's something we do, but it's a short-term kind of thing, right? We are leading trainings for allies. Allies and advocates are supposed to advocate, which is to say it is a long-term effort to address these climate issues, to address microaggressions when they occur, to talk about the inequities in evaluations, right? One of the things that a lot of people are struck by, and it comes up in search committees and it comes up in advancement, is the inequities around how work is evaluated. Most of the men allies in those trainings were unaware that women's publications are valued less, grants are valued less in an evaluation process. They're given less weight, and that in fact women have to be more successful to go. So that's the kind of behind the scenes work in a search committee or in an evaluation process, where you can advocate and say, look, that work is high quality. That is something that we should put as much value on as we do on others. And also then, of course, to take an active role, frankly, in taking on some of these service loads that you heard both Kristen and Stephanie talk about in the focus groups, that women are expected to do more service and yet somehow receive less credit for that service. And so those are the kinds of things that we're working on. And like I said, we'll probably have some more time for that in the open discussion to talk about the implementation.
Thanks, Andrew. So we're going to quickly wrap up some analytical takeaway points we've been working on. We have in this grant really focused heavily on the role that advocates and allies can take in making transformation. And so now that we're about wrapped up with our grant, it's time to reflect on how that's going and how we want to invest in the future. Next slide, please. So ideally, the Advocates and Allies program is a key to transformation. And so there are people in positions of influence with respect, and people look up to them on campus. And so by harnessing all of that, social capital, we can deploy their sphere of influence to make change, call in rather than calling out, as Andrew said, people out there kind of often accidentally making mistakes in meetings, not always, and in evaluation of candidates, by educating them, by saying, we're not all responsible for being fed all this misinformation throughout our careers, and it's time to correct that. And then when you do bring people in, you can move the needle, you can make some changes. And when you do make some changes, we really need to celebrate those and make those clear to the campus community, because then everyone sees it and says, oh, this Advocates and Allies program is working and it is changing culture. And in doing that, you expand the sphere of influence, and then you can redeploy it. And so eventually it becomes like, it spreads, right? It's contagious in a positive way. And you can create a sea change on a campus through this method, ideally. Next slide, please. There are obstacles, of course. As Andrew said, the turnout is not as high as we wish it were. And that metaphor of preaching to the choir is something we use a lot. And maybe the choir is too small, the people who think this is a problem and show up. And I think also people think this is only for me if I care about it. And that's something we need to work on. And the apathy, because it is voluntary, which is different than the GEPs, right? So NSF is voluntary. Not everybody applies for NSF grants, and the GEPs are not optional, right? And I know that the way that they are implemented is affected by that. But here, this is optional, and that may mean that being the white knight or the good guy or whatever it is may only be prioritized when people have time and the leisure to do so, which is frankly not very often because people are very busy. I think we may have overestimated the knowledge, gender theory is complicated, and these intersecting inequalities are complicated, and it takes maybe more than an hour and a half to really to kind of get on board with that. And so this iterative approach that we're hoping for can help expand that. And the approach itself may be too individualized, just bringing in the people who want to know more, who care about this, and then they go back to their home units where they are the unusual person. They are the person who stands out as maybe what people might call a social justice warrior or something that can be used in a derogatory way to marginalize them further, may not work. That may not be the approach to take. Go ahead, yes. So we're asking ourselves now, is this model sustainable? How can we make it sustainable for the long term? How can we assess our impact? And who are we leaving out in this approach? Next slide, please. And so one thing that has come up again and again throughout the past couple of years is using these terms male, female, woman, and man is possibly excluding groups of people, maybe non-binary people who care about a gendered power dynamic, regardless of how they identify personally. And so there's been some conversations about redefining this as not a men and women problem, but as a feminist problem. And then you can expand who's included. Of course, the term feminist is hyper politicized, and that we may need to think of another term that means something similar that can call people in without alienating the project. Okay, last slide. And so I just wanted to give you one last quote from this person who really kind of defined this quite well. She's a white woman assistant professor, and she said, my colleague did this advocates and allies training, and we were talking, and he said, yeah, when your chair puts you down or just poo-poos your ideas, I'm going to stand up for you. That can be my role, and I will help you. And I'm like, thanks, that's nice of you. I appreciate you doing that, but I also feel like I need to find my voice. I feel that's what Thrive could help me with. It's my voice, because I put out a good idea and somebody poo-poos it. I think I need to learn how to be a little more strategic in those conversations. I can't always rely on the men to be the ones standing up for me. I need to also stand up for myself. And I think having those resources will be really helpful. I don't see that as fixing women. I feel like that's empowering me, giving me a larger toolkit to address some of those things that you don't realize you're going to have to address. So that goes back to the initial goal of the NSF, is not to fix the women, but I think we've made enough transformation that the women are saying, okay, now it's time to bring the conversation back to us. So I think we're ready to have a Q&A. I apologize for going over a little bit, but thank you for sticking with us. And Allison, I'll turn it back over to you.
I'll reiterate what Kristen said. Thank you all for inviting us, and we're excited to hear more about your thoughts and questions and suggestions.